A world perspective that is presumably more geographically and historically widespread than any other is sweeping through the world again like a whispering wind, but with an overlooked momentum. It's a wind that brings the voices of nature to life in countless new stories in books, movies, and television series based on close relations of friendship and even kinship between man and nature. This world perspective is usually characterized as animism and strikes many people as very, very strange. But the fact that it's spreading is interesting for a number of reasons. One of them being that we live in an age where the biodiversity and climate crisis is accelerating with catastrophical consequences. This might motivate us to rethink the very foundations of the rather hostile relations to nature that we as humans are mostly engaged in today. My name is Rune Engelbrecht Larsen, and I am a Danish historian of ideas, a writer, and a poet. I would like to share a few thoughts on how animism is spreading to such an extent, especially in popular culture, and why and how this might be relevant at a time of nature and climate crisis. In conclusion, I link these thoughts to a flag that stems from the Viking Age but has been relaunched as a contemporary symbol of the much needed connectedness between man and nature, the raven flag. Homo sapiens is merely one of roughly 10 million species on Earth. We are all historically connected in various ways, and basically we all consist of the same biological building blocks. We are leaves on a tree, and the roots of that tree are wondrously tangled ramifications of evolution that stretch back to the emergence of life in the oceans. The blue planet became the living planet. But maybe the living planet is also the lonely planet. Either way, we don't know of any other living planet than our own. Obviously, the notion that life is absent everywhere else in the universe seems quite improbable. But in this particular solar system, there is only life on one planet. Besides, the lifeless distances of the universe are literally so astronomical that we will never be traveling to another solar system on any other spaceship than that of our own imagination, I guess. However, millions of different species and maybe sextillions of individual animals, plants, and fungi of an astounding variety and beauty are concentrated right here on this very globe. The diversity of life on Earth seems to be a unique and invaluable exception, or at the very least a cosmic rarity that we really ought to protect. And yet, we have never eradicated more species or impoverished nature in as devastating and often irreparable ways than today, where the activities of humans have culminated in two global catastrophes: the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. We have become alienated from nature and the other species with whom we share the planet. But it wasn't always like that. The experience of nature as a home that houses other species than Homo sapiens, as well as other persons than humans, is not only widespread from the Stone Age to the Iron Age, but also historically and presently among countless of indigenous peoples and in a number of religions. Close ties are established to various species and specific natural phenomena through storytelling, visual arts, music, rituals, and customary practices, which, for cultural or personal reasons, seem to be of particular importance. Various animals, trees, rivers, mountains, and celestial bodies, for example, are incorporated in spiritual understandings and expressed as friendships and kinships, and thereby transgress dividing biological lines. We often characterize world perspectives of this kind as animism, although this doesn't signify any ism in the sense of a doctrinal system associated with some sort of articulated philosophy, ideology, or religion. Fundamentally, it's a perspective deeply embedded in a widespread way of connecting respectfully to other forces and persons in nature. In a marginal way, it is comparable to how a modern family relates to their pets, with whom children as well as adults often engage in personal relations, generally embracing them with great affection, usually by giving them names, maybe even dressing them up, celebrating their birthdays, and essentially by including them as family members. It's a behavior within the same broad spectrum as classic animist traditions, although, in most contemporary views, to a less controversial degree than in the kind of animist relations where some or even all species and other natural phenomena could be regarded as actual persons or as connected to spiritual persons. Few people probably reflect on this while walking the dog, and for most of us, an anthropocentric world perspective is alpha and omega, whereas an animist world perspective is just extremely strange. But considering the fact that animism presumably is the most common world perspective historically as well as geographically, it's actually not particularly odd or even exotic. We find animism embedded in major cultures that make up most of the ancient cultural roots to the so-called Western world: Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. But also in Northern Europe up until the end of the Iron Age, the last centuries of which are known as the Viking Age. When people establish respectful relations of friendship and kinship to other species and natural phenomena, they are less likely to be motivated by sheer greed to exploit these friends and relatives in nature. This doesn't mean that animist relations constitute insurmountable barriers against any exploitation, or that they are devoid of conflicts of interest, but they do originate in perspectives on nature and culture that in a number of ways contrast the destructive contemporary anthropocentric zeitgeist. This contrast is highlighted by the unambiguous scientific realization that the evolving climate and biodiversity catastrophes are man-made. The meticulous analysis of global data by countless scientists point to the necessity of radical societal changes in order to end the accelerating overconsumption, which ultimately is the driving force behind both global crises, and is why they are actually just two aspects of the same crisis. This might at least motivate us to take a deeper look at the cross-cultural perspectives of our animist heritage that are anchored in a deep sense of connectedness to nature as opposed to limitless exploitation. These ideas are already on the rise and are exemplified in the increase of collaborative projects between indigenous peoples and authorities and NGOs with the explicit purpose to enhance biodiversity and the rewilding of a wide variety of natural environments, while simultaneously strengthening and reconnecting with their own animist heritage. The American bison, for example, is returned as a keystone species in some areas of the grasslands of the Great Plains in cooperation with Native Americans in order to improve biodiversity and thereby create a cascade of beneficial effects that ripple out to the entire ecosystem. This is quite simply achieved as a consequence of its eating patterns, trampling and wallowing, which benefits a lot of other species. But for many Native Americans, it's also the return of brother bison, in a profound spiritual sense. Animism has also influenced laws and constitutions in order to protect ecosystems and species in more efficient ways by connecting to local and regional animist perspectives. Nature has been recognized as subject of rights in the Constitution of Ecuador, effectively stating that Pachamama, Mother Nature, is a legal person, a nature goddess revered by indigenous peoples of the Andes. In other countries, rivers have been recognized as legal persons. It's not an uncommon understanding in contemporary anthropology that a sharp distinction between person and non-person isn't ontologically absolute, but rather culturally determined. As previously mentioned, animist perspectives that transgress this distinction are historically very common. We don't even need to dive deep into history in order to find animism fully displayed in Western traditions and folklore. Voluminous works about Danish folklore, based on accounts from thousands of people in the 19th century, describe how the rural population at that time still regarded their world as a place full of non-human persons, with whom many also engage in ritual relations. We see the same picture in other Western countries, where neither the pressure from institutionalized religion nor rationalism from the age of enlightenment were successful in their efforts to suppress widespread animism among the common people. Folklore also inspired a rich fairy tale tradition in which the relations between humans and other than human persons is a pivotal theme. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, not only comic books, cartoons, and computer games have picked up the baton. Also, a number of successful novels, television, and movie productions are obviously influenced by the spirit of animism. For instance, global bestsellers like J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, and Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials. The same goes for James Cameron's blockbuster Avatar, Guillermo del Toro's Oscar-winning movie The Shape of Water, and the television series American Gods, based on the novel by Neil Gaiman. And those are just the tip of the iceberg. Animism is like a whispering wind sweeping through the world with an overlooked momentum, although hardly ever mentioned. A wind that brings the voices of nature to life in new stories, but originates from perspectives that are rarely preoccupied with sharp distinctions between culture and nature, or between a natural and a supernatural world. Perspectives that don't plow through the world and leave behind the same dualistic abyss between subjects and objects that we are so accustomed to in the anthropocentric worldviews that single out and separate humans from the rest of the world. Animist worlds are continuous like an ocean, not separate buckets of water. This is why historical and prehistorical art, myths, and folklore are full of figures that are half men and half animals. We know of shamans dressed in antlers and furs from rock art as well as burials. And in Scandinavia, we know of similar metamorphoses from the Gundestrup cauldron, the golden horns of Galehus, and numerous mask helmets. All over the world, different cultures depict lion persons and seal persons, tree persons and river persons, bear persons and raven persons, and so forth. When we strengthen the connectedness between man and nature through new depictions and stories, we are also retelling animist relations and opposing the anthropocentric dissociation that has led to the indifference and greed at the core of the destruction of nature. This is why not only I raise the raven flag. I've tried to express some of these thoughts in the first stanza of a poem in Danish, my native tongue, but with a literary prose translation. Ravnens sorte vinger minder, og som viderne vi finder. I det fri, i måneskinnet, i os selv et sted i sindet. I kultur, der er forpligtet, i natur, som vi har svigtet. I et slægtskab mellem arter, i forsømte pagters parter. I de stemmer, vi fornemmer, men som tidens normer hæmmer. Det er lag, som vi vil favne, derfor flager vi med ravne, derfor vil vi ændre banen, det fortæller vi med fanen.